Aniah Blanchard's vibrant life ends abruptly at a gas station, leaving a trail of forensic evidence and a community in mourning. We weave this harrowing disappearance into a steady downpour, grounding the tragic search and eventual justice in a somber, rhythmic atmosphere that facilitates rest while honoring a legacy of profound loss. Tonight, we begin not with facts, but with feeling. Let yourself be carried somewhere specific, somewhere real. Alabama, late October, the kind of night that arrives without ceremony. The sky already dark before 6. The air carrying that particular autumn weight that sits between warmth and cold, unsure of what it wants to become. The roads are wet. They've been wet for hours. Rain moved in sometime after sundown, the quiet, persistent kind that does not announce itself with thunder or lightning, but simply begins and continues, steady as a heartbeat, steady as breathing, steady as the kind of grief that does not peak and pass, but instead settles in and stays. It falls on everything equally. On the oak trees lining the campus roads of Auburn, on the hoods of cars parked outside apartment complexes where lights are still on, where people are still awake, where life is still moving at its ordinary Wednesday pace. It falls on the canopy of a convenience store on the edge of town, the kind of place that exists in every city and registers in no one's memory unless something happens there to make it permanent. On the night of October 23rd, 2019, something happened there that made it permanent. The rain was already falling when it began. It kept falling long after, and tonight it will fall through every word of this story, not to deepen the darkness of the telling, but to hold the weight of it, to give her memory the space it has always deserved. Here is something worth sitting with before this story moves another inch forward. October 23rd, 2019 was a Wednesday, not a holiday, not a date circled on any calendar for any significant reason. It was the kind of day that passes through a week the way most Wednesdays do, carrying the ordinary weight of classes attended, errands run, meals eaten, messages sent. People in Auburn woke up that morning and moved through their hours without any sense that something was different about the air, without any interior warning that the day would leave a mark that could not be removed. That is the part that stays with you if you let it. Not the crime itself, though the crime is what we are here to discuss, but the ordinariness of the hours before it. The complete and total absence of announcement. Because the most irreversible moments in human life almost never come with a signal. They do not arrive dressed as catastrophes. They arrive dressed as Wednesdays. They arrive while the rain is already falling, and the convenience store lights are already on, and someone who matters enormously to the people who love her is simply living her life at the pace she has always lived it, unaware that one decision, one brief stop, one ordinary errand on one forgettable weeknight is about to become the last ordinary moment she will ever have. That is the reality this story asks you to hold. Not as fear. Not as a warning to be carried anxiously into every routine decision you make after tonight, but as an honest acknowledgement of what it means to be human in a world where ordinary Wednesdays can change everything without asking permission first. October 23rd, 2019 was a Wednesday, and it changed everything. Have you ever had a night so routine that you barely remembered it the next morning? Not a bad night, not a good one either. Just an ordinary night that dissolved into the week the way ordinary nights do. No sharp edges, no moments worth preserving, nothing that demanded to be held onto. You drove somewhere, maybe, stopped for something small, filled your tank or grabbed a drink or picked up something you needed on the way home. You moved through it quickly because there was nothing about it that suggested it deserved your full attention. And by the time you were back home, the night had already begun to blur at the edges, becoming nothing more than a footnote to a week you would forget entirely by the following month. Most nights are like that. Most nights should be like that. Now hold that feeling for just a moment and turn it in a different direction. What if, on one of those nights, one of those completely forgettable, completely unremarkable evenings that asked nothing of you and gave nothing back, someone you loved was living the last ordinary moment of their life. Not somewhere far away, not in a context so different from yours that you could separate yourself from it with distance, but somewhere close, somewhere familiar, somewhere that looked exactly like the kinds of places you move through every week without a second thought. What if their last ordinary moment looked exactly like yours? That is not a question designed to frighten you. It is a question designed to bring you closer to Aniah Blanchard, because before she became a case, before she became a headline, before she became a name attached to a law that would change an entire state, she was simply a young woman having a Wednesday night. Here is what this story is about, stated plainly, because it deserves plainness. On the night of October 23, 2019, Aniah Blanchard stopped at a convenience store in Auburn, Alabama. She was 18 years old. She was a college student with a direction, a family that loved her, and a future that was still being built. She stopped because people stop at convenience stores on Wednesday nights. It is one of the most common and unremarkable things a person can do, and she did it without any reason to believe it would cost her anything at all. Inside that store, she encountered a man who made a choice that ended her life. What the investigation would later reveal, and what this story will walk through in full, is that the danger she encountered that night did not begin at the gas station. It had been moving toward her long before she arrived there, carried by a failure in the very systems that exist specifically to prevent moments exactly like that one. A man with documented violent charges was free that night when he should not have been. That is not speculation. That is a fact that an entire state would eventually be forced to reckon with. This story covers everything. Her life before that night, the warmth of it, the ambition of it, the complete and irreducible humanity of it, the disappearance, the search that followed, the evidence that accumulated, the justice that came, slow and insufficient and necessary all at once, and the law that now carries her name because her family refused to let her story end with a verdict. The rain is already falling. The story is already in motion. Stay with it. Before this story moves forward, take a moment to do something small. If you found your way to this channel tonight because you needed somewhere quiet to rest, somewhere that takes real stories seriously and tells them with the care they deserve, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on your notifications so that every time a new story is ready, it finds you. This community gathers every night around stories that matter, stories that carry real names and real consequences, and real lessons that do not disappear when the video ends. Your presence here is not incidental. It is part of what makes this space worth building. Now, Aniah Blanchard. She was 18 years old. She had a laugh that people remembered. She had a plan for her life that involved animals and science and the particular kind of purposeful future that only emerges when someone young enough to still be building themselves already knows, with quiet confidence, what direction they are moving in. She had a stepfather who spoke about her with the specific tenderness of a man who understood that family is not always biological and that love does not require blood to run deep. She had a mother, a boyfriend, a circle of people for whom her absence would not be an abstract loss but a daily, present physical reality that restructured everything around it. She deserved a Thursday morning. She deserved the rest of her Wednesdays. Tonight, in the steady company of this rain, her story will be told in full, with the honesty it demands and the respect it has always been owed. Stay with it. She is worth every word. She was born in 2001, which means she arrived in the world at the turn of a century still deciding what it wanted to be. And she spent every year after that doing exactly the same thing, quietly and with intention. Aniah Blanchard grew up in the particular way that children of loving households grow up, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary friction of becoming a person, but with the steady knowledge that there were people in her corner who were not going anywhere. That knowledge does things to a young woman. It gives her a particular kind of confidence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demands rooms adjust to it, but the grounded kind. the kind that allows a person to move through the world at their own pace because they have never had reason to doubt that the world would hold them. Her mother was Angela Harris. Her stepfather was Walt Harris, a man who competed as a professional heavyweight fighter in the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which meant that his name carried public weight in circles that follow combat sports with the kind of loyalty most people reserve for religion or family. But within the walls of their home, the weight that mattered was different. Walt Harris was not a public figure first and a father second. He was a father first, in the fullest sense of that word, who happened to also be a public figure. The distinction matters enormously. Men who lead with their public identity treat their private relationships as extensions of their image. Walt Harris did not operate that way. The way he spoke about Aniah, the specific warmth of it, the complete absence of performance in it, told you everything you needed to know about the kind of household she had grown up inside. Angela Harris raised a daughter who knew she was loved. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the most structurally important things a parent can give a child, because a young woman who knows she is loved tends to make decisions that reflect that knowledge. She tends to build towards something. She tends to have a direction. Aniah had a direction. She was enrolled at Southern Union State Community College, pursuing a degree in veterinary science. Spend a moment with that choice, because it is not incidental. Veterinary science is not the path of least resistance. It is not the major someone selects because they cannot think of anything else. It requires a particular combination of intellectual rigor and emotional capacity. The ability to understand living systems at a biological level, while also caring, genuinely and practically, about the creatures those systems belong to. It is a field that asks something of the people who enter it. It asks for patience. It asks for precision. It asks for the willingness to sit with vulnerability. An animal that cannot tell you where it hurts. A creature entirely dependent on the competence and compassion of the person standing over it. Aniah was drawn to exactly that. The caring for things that could not always advocate for themselves. The protection of life in its most unguarded forms. People who study animals tend to carry their relationship with living things into every other part of their existence. They notice the dog at the edge of a parking lot before most people do. They register the discomfort of a creature that everyone else has already stopped seeing. They are attuned, in other words, to the kind of quiet suffering that does not announce itself. That attunement rarely stays contained to the professional. It bleeds into the personal. It becomes a way of moving through the world with a particular quality of attention, a particular willingness to slow down for things that need slowing down. That was Aniah. That was the shape of her. Her boyfriend was Yusuf al-Hasnawi. He was not a peripheral figure in her life. He was a present one. Relationships at 18 are sometimes dismissed as preliminary, as rehearsals for the more serious connections that come later, but that dismissal says more about the people doing the dismissing than it does about the relationships themselves. What Yusuf al-Hasnawi represented in Aniah's life was genuine companionship, someone she was building something with, even if neither of them would have used that language at the time. He was the person she checked in with, the person whose calls she answered, the person who, when she stopped answering, would be among the first to understand that something had gone deeply and irreversibly wrong. She had friends. She had the texture of a social life that belonged to a young woman who was well liked without needing to be the loudest person in any room. She moved through Southern Union State Community College the way students with genuine academic purpose tend to move, with their attention split productively between the work in front of them and the life being built around it. She was not a person who drifted. She was not someone whose days accumulated without direction. She was pointed at something specific, and the people around her could feel it. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that is easy to overlook when a story begins where this one eventually goes. When a young woman's life is discussed primarily through the context of what was done to her, there is a tendency, subtle but persistent, for her identity to contract around the crime, for everything she was to be reduced to everything that was taken. This story will not do that. The facts of what happened to Aniah Blanchard are real, and they will be told. But before any of that, she was a person who woke up on ordinary mornings and moved through ordinary days and had plans and preferences, and a laugh that people who knew her remember specifically enough to describe. She was a daughter who made her parents proud in the way that matters most, not through performance or achievement designed for public consumption, but through the daily evidence of a person becoming who they are supposed to be. She was a girlfriend who showed up, a classmate with a direction, a young woman with a future that was, in October of 2019, still very much in the process of being built. The building had not finished. It had barely begun. And on a Wednesday evening in late October, in a town that should have been safe enough for exactly this kind of ordinary young life, something happened that stopped the building entirely. But before that Wednesday evening arrives in this story, and it will arrive in full, she deserves to be known first. Not as a victim, not as a case number, not as the name of a law passed by a state legislature, simply as Aniah Blanchard, born in 2001, enrolled in veterinary science, loved by her family, known by her friends, moving through her days with the particular, quiet confidence of a young woman who had every reason to believe the future was waiting for her. It simply ran out of time. To understand what was lost on October 2003, 2019, you first need to understand where it was lost, because place matters. It always matters. The geography of a tragedy is never incidental. It is part of the meaning, part of the reason certain losses land the way they do and refuse to move. Auburn, Alabama is a college town. Not in the vague administrative sense of a place that happens to have a university within its boundaries, but in the lived, felt, daily experienced sense of a place that has organized itself entirely around the presence of young people in the process of becoming. Auburn University sits at the center of the city the way a heartbeat sits at the center of a body. Everything else orients around it. The streets, the businesses, the social rhythms, the unspoken agreements about what this place is for and who it belongs to, all of it radiates outward from that center. What that produces is a particular kind of atmosphere, not frantic, not loud in the way that larger cities are loud, but alive in a specific way, charged with the forward-leaning energy of people who are still early enough in their lives to believe, with genuine conviction, that the best of what is coming has not yet arrived. College towns carry that energy in their air the way coastal towns carry salt. You feel it when you walk the streets on a Thursday evening. You feel it on football Saturdays when the stadium fills and the whole city exhales into something communal and uncomplicated. You feel it in the late-night convenience store runs that happen not because anyone particularly needs anything, but because the night is still young, and there is nowhere else to be, and the ordinary act of going somewhere feels like enough. That was the Auburn that Aniah Blanchard moved through. Not a dangerous place, by any reasonable measure. Not the kind of city that announces itself as somewhere you need to be careful. Auburn, in the minds of the people who lived there and the families who sent their children there, was the kind of place where a young woman could build a life without having to carry the constant awareness of threat that burdens people in environments less forgiving than this one. It was familiar. It was manageable. It was, in the most meaningful sense of the word, safe. That belief, that particular deeply human confidence in the safety of a known place, is worth holding on to as this story moves forward. Not because it was foolish. It was not foolish. It was reasonable. Auburn had earned that confidence in the minds of its residents through years of ordinary life unfolding without catastrophe. The problem with earned confidence, though, is that it can make the extraordinary feel impossible right up until the moment it arrives. Southern Union State Community College, where Aniah was enrolled, sits in Wadley, roughly an hour from Auburn. The geography of her life, then, was one of movement. She traveled between places, between home and campus, between the obligations of her academic life and the textures of her personal one. Young people in college exist in that kind of motion almost constantly, commuting, visiting, returning, departing. Movement is the state they live inside. It is so normal as to be entirely unremarkable. On October 23, 2019, Aniah was in Auburn. The day itself arrived the way late October days arrive in Alabama, with a coolness in the morning air that softened as the hours moved, the sky carrying the particular gray-white quality of a day that could not quite commit to either cloud or clarity. It was a Wednesday, which meant the week was already past its midpoint, already leaning toward the weekend without quite reaching it. The rhythm of a Wednesday has a specific quality, a kind of settled momentum, neither the fresh start energy of a Monday nor the anticipatory looseness of a Friday. Wednesdays are work days, productivity days, days that ask you to keep your head down and move through what needs to be moved through. That is what Aniah did. She moved through her Wednesday the way a person moves through a day that asks nothing unusual of them. The details of her specific hours, the precise sequence of where she went and what she did before the evening arrived, belong to the private record of a life that was hers alone to live. What can be said is this: nothing about the day, as it unfolded in its ordinary succession of hours, suggested that it was moving toward anything other than a Wednesday night, and then a Thursday morning, and then the rest of the week completing itself the way weeks do. By the time evening arrived, the rain had already settled in. Not dramatically, not in the way that storms arrive, with advance notice and atmospheric theater. It arrived the way it had been arriving all night throughout this story, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. It fell on Auburn the way it falls on every college town in October, coating the streets with a sheen that catches the light, filling the air with that particular clean, wet smell that rain produces when it lands on pavement that has been warm all day and is now cooling into night. Aniah was out in it, moving through a Wednesday evening in a city that had never given her reason to believe that an ordinary errand could carry extraordinary consequences. She had no reason to be on guard. She had no reason to feel the specific alertness that people carry in places where danger has already made itself known. Auburn had not done that to her. Auburn had, up until this point in her story, been exactly what a college town is supposed to be. A place where a young woman can become who she is meant to become without having to spend energy protecting herself from a threat she cannot yet name. She was in her car. The rain was on the windshield. The night was ordinary in every direction she looked, and somewhere ahead of her, at a convenience store on the edge of that ordinary Wednesday night, a decision she had not yet made was waiting for her. The decision to stop, briefly, for something small. The kind of decision that a person makes dozens of times without consequence before the one time that it costs them everything. That stop was still minutes away. But the night was already in motion, and the rain, as it always does in this story, kept falling. There is a particular quality to rain that falls without urgency, not the rain that announces itself with pressure and speed, the kind that sends people running for cover and makes conversation impossible and demands that everything pause until it decides to stop. That kind of rain is an event. It interrupts. It inserts itself into the middle of whatever is happening and redirects attention entirely toward itself. This is not that rain. This is the other kind. The kind that arrives so gradually that most people cannot name the precise moment it began. The kind that does not ask you to stop what you are doing or reroute your evening or reconsider your plans. It simply arrives and then it continues. And after a while you stop noticing it consciously and it becomes instead something your body knows without your mind having to engage with it. The sound of it at the edge of your awareness. The coolness it adds to the air. The way it turns every surface it touches slightly more reflective, slightly more alive to the light around it. That is the rain that fell on Auburn on the night of October 23, 2019. And that is precisely the kind of rain this story asks you to sit with tonight. Not because rain is dramatic, not because weather is a metaphor that needs to be underlined, but because this particular rain, patient, persistent, unhurried, has something to teach about grief that no other image in this story can quite replicate. Grief, when it is the deep kind, does not arrive as a storm. People expect it to. When something catastrophic enters a life, the assumption is that the emotional response will arrive with equivalent force, sudden, overwhelming, impossible to remain upright inside. And sometimes it does arrive that way, in the first moments when the news is new and the body has not yet found its footing. But grief that lasts, the kind that becomes structural, the kind that reconstructs a person's relationship to time itself, does not sustain itself at that pitch. It settles. It becomes the rain that is always there at the edge of awareness, the sound you stop consciously hearing but never stop carrying, the moisture in the air that changes how everything else feels without ever drawing attention to the change itself. The family of Aniah Blanchard would come to know that kind of grief with a thoroughness that cannot be communicated in words sufficient to hold it. Walt Harris would come to know it. Angela Harris would come to know it. Yusuf al-Haznawi would come to know it. The students at Southern Union State Community College who had known her in the specific, low-key way that classmates know each other, by sight, by reputation, by the particular energy someone brings into a room, they would come to know a version of it too. And the community of Auburn, which had believed itself safe in the way that comfortable places believe themselves safe, would come to know a collective version of it that changed the texture of the town in ways that lingered long after the news cycle moved on. None of them knew any of that yet. Not on October 23rd, 2019. The rain was falling, and the night was ordinary, and the grief was not yet grief because the loss had not yet arrived in a form anyone could name. But the rain knew, or at least that is how it feels in retrospect. The way certain details accumulate, meaning backward through time, becoming significant only after the events that make them significant have already occurred. The rain that fell on Auburn that night was ordinary in every meteorological sense. It was a weather pattern moving through a region in late October. It had no knowledge of what was happening beneath it, no awareness of the specific young woman moving through the wet streets in her car, no capacity to register the difference between one Wednesday night and another. And yet, when we tell this story, the rain is always there. Not because we placed it there artificially, but because it was genuinely present, and because presence, in the aftermath of loss, becomes its own kind of testimony. The rain was a witness, not a knowing one, but a witness nonetheless. It fell on the convenience store where a life changed. It fell on the streets that search teams would later walk. It fell on the parking lots where flyers would be distributed and the fields where people would look for someone who had already been taken somewhere no search party could reach. It is still falling now, in the telling of this story. That is the agreement this channel makes with you every night, that the rain does not stop, because the grief does not stop, because the loss does not stop being real simply because time has continued moving past it. The rain is how this space holds that truth without flinching from it. Slow, deliberate, patient in the way that only things with no agenda can afford to be patient. Let it fall on you now, at the edge of your awareness, the way rain falls on a city that does not yet know what is coming. Let it be the sound underneath everything that follows in this story, the steady percussion that keeps time while the narrative moves through its harder passages. Let it remind you each time you notice it, that you are not listening to a distant account of something that happened to someone else. You are listening to the story of a real person who moved through real rain on a real Wednesday night, and whose absence is still, years later, the kind that reshapes the space around it. The sound of rain falling on Auburn in late October, the image of a young woman who was, by every measure available to the people who loved her, exactly who she was supposed to be at 18. A daughter, a student, a person with direction and warmth and the specific kind of quiet confidence that comes from being genuinely known and genuinely loved. Wednesday night is about to stop being ordinary, and the rain, as always, will be there when it does. At approximately 11:30 p.m. on October 23, 2019, Aniah Blanchard pulled into a convenience store and gas station in Auburn, Alabama. Sit with the time for a moment. 11:30 at night. The hour itself is worth acknowledging, not because it carries inherent danger. Countless people move through 11:30 p.m. on any given Wednesday without consequence, but because of what it tells you about the texture of her evening. She had been somewhere. She was going somewhere. She was in motion, the way young people in college are almost always in motion, navigating the gap between the hours structured by obligation and the hours that belong only to themselves. 11:30 on a Wednesday night is not reckless. It is simply late, and late is a state that belongs to anyone who decides it does. The convenience store was the kind of place that exists in every American city without distinguishing itself from any other. Bright interior, a handful of aisles carrying the standard inventory of quick needs, drinks, snacks, the small practical items that people stop for when they are between one place and another and realize they need something minor before they arrive. The rain was on the windows. The parking lot outside carried that particular wet night quality, puddles catching the overhead light, the asphalt darker and more reflective than it would have been in daylight. Inside, the contrast was sharp. The warmth of the store against the cool damp outside, the low-grade hum of a space designed for efficiency rather than comfort, functional rather than welcoming, the kind of place you are in and then out of, without much memory of the transition. Aniah went in. Surveillance cameras mounted inside the store captured her presence. That footage would become, in the weeks that followed, one of the most studied pieces of visual evidence in the investigation, reviewed and re-reviewed by investigators looking for every detail it could yield. But in the moment it was recorded, it was nothing more than what surveillance cameras always are, an automated record of ordinary life moving through an ordinary space. She was there. She moved through the store the way a person moves through a place they have no reason to linger in. She was not rushing. She was not distressed. She was simply present, doing what she had stopped to do in a place that had no visible reason to concern her. She was not alone. Another person was inside the store that night. A man. At this point in the investigation, in these first hours, before the footage had been fully analyzed and before witness accounts had been formally collected and cross-referenced, he was exactly that, and nothing more. A man, unidentified, unconnected in any official capacity to Aniah or her life, or anything that would have made his presence in that store carry significance. He was simply another person inside a convenience store at 11:30 p.m. on a Wednesday night in Auburn. That is how it looked. That is not what it was. What surveillance footage captured, and what witness statements would later confirm in precise and devastating detail, was an interaction between them. Brief, the kind of exchange that, removed from its context and consequences, might have registered as nothing. A few seconds of proximity in a small commercial space, the sort of unremarkable human near contact that happens hundreds of times a day in places exactly like this one. But this interaction was not unremarkable. What followed it made that impossible. Aniah exited the store. The sequence of events that unfolded in the parking lot of that gas station, in the rain, in the late-night quiet of a Wednesday in Auburn, happened fast. That is one of the facts that investigators would later establish with consistency across witness accounts and physical evidence. This was not a prolonged encounter. It was not a situation that extended over minutes in a way that might have allowed for intervention or escape or the kind of recalibration that people imagine they would manage if they found themselves inside a moment like this one. It was fast, and it was targeted, and it was over before the surrounding world had any opportunity to respond to it. Aniah was forced into her own vehicle. Her black Honda CR-V, which had carried her through the ordinary geography of her ordinary Wednesday, became in that parking lot something entirely different. It became the last enclosed space she would occupy under the control of another person's choices rather than her own. The man who forced her into that vehicle left with her. The store's cameras had already done what they were going to do. The witnesses who had been present had seen what they had seen, and the parking lot returned, in the seconds after, to the same rain-wet quiet it had held before, as though the world had not just changed irrevocably in the space between one moment and the next. Auburn did not know yet. The city was still Wednesday night, still the steady rain, still the campus lights, still the particular hum of a college town past midnight, when most people are already inside and the streets have given themselves over to quiet. No alarm had been raised. No one had called anyone. The missing person report that would eventually mobilize law enforcement had not yet been filed, because the people who would file it did not yet know there was anything to file it about. That is the gap this story now enters. The gap between the moment something irreversible happens and the moment the people who love someone realize that it has. It is not a long gap, measured in hours, but it is its own particular territory, a space where everything has already changed and almost no one knows it yet. The rain kept falling on the parking lot, on the wet asphalt where Aniah's car had been, on the windows of a convenience store whose cameras had captured something that would take weeks to fully understand and a lifetime to fully carry. It kept falling as it always does in this story, as it always does. There is something worth naming about the specific silence that follows a violent act in a public space. Not the silence of emptiness. The store was still lit. The rain was still audible. The world was still technically in motion around the absence that had just been created. But a different kind of silence. The kind that settles into a place after something has happened that the place itself was never designed to absorb. Convenience stores are built for transactions, for the brief, functional exchange of money and goods between strangers who will never think of each other again. They are not built to be the last ordinary place a person stands before everything changes. And yet, with a frequency that should disturb us more than it does, that is precisely what they become. That store on the edge of Auburn became that on October 23, 2019, at approximately 11:30 p.m., Aniah had been there, and then she was gone. And the rain fell on a parking lot that did not know how to hold what had just happened inside it. Silence, when it comes from someone who has never given you reason to expect it, does not announce itself as danger immediately. It announces itself first as an inconvenience, then as a mild concern. Then, if it persists past the point where every reasonable explanation has been tested and found insufficient, it announces itself as something that has no name yet, but occupies the body the way dread does, low and settled and impossible to argue away. That was the progression that Yusuf al-Hasnawi moved through in the hours after Aniah left that gas station parking lot, a message sent and not returned, a call placed and not answered. The first of these things registers as nothing. Phones are on silent, people are driving, there are 100 explanations that require no alarm and carry no weight. The second registers as slightly more than nothing, but still well within the range of ordinary. The third begins to shift something, not dramatically, not yet. But the shift is real, and the body records it even when the mind is still constructing reasons not to. He tried again. The phone rang into silence with the specific quality that distinguishes an unanswered call from a disconnected one. The signal was going through, which meant the phone existed and was reachable and was simply not being picked up. That distinction matters. A disconnected phone tells a story about battery life or poor coverage. A phone that rings and produces nothing tells a different story. One that the mind resists reading directly for as long as it possibly can. Her family tried to reach her as well. Angela Harris, Walt Harris, the people for whom Aniah's voice on the other end of a call was not an abstract comfort but a daily practical reality. The sound that confirmed she was fine. She was where she said she was. The evening was proceeding as evenings proceed. That sound did not come. The calls went out, and the silence came back, and with each repetition of that exchange, the space for reasonable explanation grew smaller, and the space for something else grew correspondingly larger. There is a particular kind of night that families of missing people describe in the aftermath, the night before they knew for certain, the night when the not knowing was still technically possible, when the last fraction of hope had not yet been foreclosed by evidence. It is not a peaceful night, but it is a night that exists in a category of its own, distinct from every night that follows it, because every night that follows it is organized around a confirmed reality. This night, the night of October 23 into October 24th, 2019, with the rain still falling on Auburn and the calls still going unanswered, was the last night organized around uncertainty. The last night when the worst had not yet been confirmed. They filed a missing person report. Law enforcement received it and did not treat it the way missing person reports are sometimes treated when the circumstances are ambiguous. With a measured, wait-and-see approach that prioritizes the most benign explanation until evidence demands otherwise. The circumstances here did not invite that approach. The details surrounding Aniah's last known movements were specific enough to generate immediate concern. The hour, the location, the complete absence of any communication following her departure from the gas station, the fact that nothing about Aniah Blanchard's established patterns or character or relationships suggested a reason for voluntary disappearance. Each of these details individually might have been manageable. Together they composed a picture that law enforcement recognized without requiring additional confirmation. This was not a young woman who had decided, without telling anyone, to go somewhere and not check in. The people who knew her best understood this before any investigator articulated it. Yusuf al-Hasnawi understood it. Angela Harris understood it. Walt Harris understood it. The specific quality of Aniah's absence, its completeness, its total contradiction of everything she had ever established about herself as a communicator, as a daughter, as a partner, told them something that none of them wanted to know and that all of them already did. Something had happened to her. The details of what and where and at whose hands remained unknown in those hours, but the fact of it, the bare, devastating fact that she was gone in a way that was not voluntary and not safe, settled into the people who loved her before any official confirmation arrived to name it. That is the grief of uncertainty. It is not the grief that comes after confirmation, which at least has the grim dignity of being anchored to something real and known. It is the grief that exists in suspension, too heavy to carry comfortably, too unconfirmed to set down completely. You cannot mourn what you do not yet know has been lost, and yet the loss is already present in the body, already restructuring the hours, already making the ordinary operations of a night, eating, sleeping, the small mechanical movements of a life maintaining itself, feel grotesque in their continuity. The rain fell through all of it, through the unanswered calls and the filed report, and the long suspended hours of a night that refused to resolve into anything bearable. It fell on the homes where people sat with phones in their hands, and on the roads where, soon, search efforts would begin to organize themselves. It fell without urgency and without comfort, the way it had been falling all evening, patient and persistent and entirely indifferent to the specific human weight accumulating beneath it. By the time the morning of October 24 arrived, the missing person investigation was formally underway. Law enforcement was mobilized. The community was beginning to stir around the edges of the news, and somewhere in the city, in a car that belonged to Aniah Blanchard and carried everything she had left behind, evidence was waiting to be found that would transform the nature of this investigation entirely. The rain did not stop. Neither did the search. Several days passed between the night Aniah Blanchard disappeared and the morning her black Honda CR-V was located in Montgomery, Alabama. Several days. That is not a short interval when measured in the specific currency of a family waiting for information about someone they love. It is not short when measured in the hours that law enforcement spent working the case with the urgency the circumstances demanded. It is not short when measured against the accumulating weight of a community that was beginning to understand, through the steady spread of information across social media and local news, that something serious had happened to a young woman from their city. Several days, in the context of a missing person investigation carrying the particular characteristics this one carried, is an expanse of time that reshapes everyone inside it. The vehicle was found in Montgomery, not Auburn, where the encounter at the gas station had occurred, not somewhere immediately adjacent to the last confirmed point of Aniah's movement. Montgomery, a city approximately an hour's drive from Auburn, which told investigators something immediately and without ambiguity. The car had been moved. Someone had driven it away from the scene of the encounter at the gas station and deposited it in a different city, which meant that whoever had taken Aniah had also taken deliberate steps to create distance between the crime and its evidence. That detail alone was significant. It spoke to intention. It spoke to a level of calculation that existed in direct and devastating contrast to the randomness that the public encounter at the convenience store might otherwise have suggested. This was not a crime of pure impulse that had no thought beyond its first moment. There had been movement afterward. There had been decisions. The car's location in Montgomery was the physical record of those decisions, and investigators read it as such from the moment they laid eyes on it. But the location of the vehicle was not the most significant thing about its discovery. What waited inside it was. Investigators who approached the black Honda CR-V in Montgomery did not open its doors expecting to find nothing. The circumstances of Aniah's disappearance had already established enough concern that no one arriving at that vehicle carried any genuine hope of a benign explanation. But there is a difference between expecting to find evidence of a crime and standing in front of that evidence once it has been found. Between the anticipation of something terrible and the direct, unmediated confrontation with it. That difference lives in the body rather than the mind, and the people who recovered that vehicle carried it in their bodies long after the procedural work of the day was complete. Inside Aniah's car, there was evidence of a violent struggle. The interior bore the marks of what had happened within it. The physical record of a person who had not gone quietly, who had not surrendered without resistance, whose body had fought against what was being done to it with everything available. There was blood, consistent with serious injury, consistent in the clinical language that forensic documentation requires, with a kind of harm that does not allow for recovery. There were personal belongings left behind, items that belonged to Aniah, ordinary possessions, the kind of things that accumulate in a person's car without thought, because a car is an extension of a life, and lives are full of small objects that travel with their owners out of habit and comfort. Those objects were still there, left behind in the specific, terrible way that things are left behind when the person they belong to has been taken somewhere against their will, not packed, not organized, not deliberately abandoned, but simply present in a space from which their owner had been removed by force. This was her car. That is the fact that sits underneath every forensic detail this part of the investigation produced, not an evidence repository, not a crime scene in the abstract institutional sense of the term. Her car, the space she had driven to the gas station that Wednesday night, the space she had expected to drive home from it, the steering wheel she had touched, the seat adjusted to her height, the particular interior geography of a vehicle that belongs to one specific person and carries, in every small arrangement of its contents, the imprint of that person's daily life. Everything inside it bore witness to what had been done to her. And everything the forensic team recovered from its interior became, in the weeks that followed, a pillar of the case that prosecutors would eventually bring to trial. The reclassification came quickly. Law enforcement had already been treating the investigation with the urgency appropriate to a suspicious disappearance. The vehicle's contents removed whatever residual ambiguity had remained. This was no longer, in any procedural or practical sense, a missing person case. It was a homicide investigation. The evidence demanded that designation, and the investigation responded accordingly. Resources realigned, the scope of the inquiry expanded. The cooperation between agencies deepened into something more coordinated and more focused. Aniah's family received the news of the vehicle's discovery the way families receive news that confirms what they have already known in their bodies for days. Not with surprise, with the specific devastation of confirmation, the closing of the door that uncertainty had been holding, fractionally open. The hope that had been too fragile to name was now formally gone, replaced by a grief that had a shape and a direction, and a cause that investigators were now working with everything they had to fully identify. The rain had not stopped. It fell on Montgomery the way it had fallen on Auburn, without urgency, without comfort, without any acknowledgement of the human weight accumulating beneath it. It fell on a parking lot where a black Honda CR-V sat as both evidence and testimony, holding in its damaged interior the clearest account available of what October 23, 2019 had actually cost. With the case now firmly repositioned as a homicide investigation, the machinery of law enforcement shifted into a different register entirely. Not faster, necessarily. The investigation had already been moving with urgency from the moment the missing person report landed, but differently, with a sharper focus. With the particular quality of attention that emerges when the question being investigated is no longer where someone is, but what was done to them, and by whom. The surveillance footage from the gas station became the investigation's most immediate priority. Cameras record without discrimination. They do not decide what is significant and what is not. They do not flag moments of interest or highlight faces that will later matter. They simply capture, continuously and without judgment, everything that moves through their field of vision. Which means that the footage from inside that Auburn convenience store on the night of October 23 held far more than the encounter between Aniah and the unidentified man. It held the entire ordinary atmosphere of a late-night convenience store, other customers, staff movement, the unremarkable visual texture of a commercial space going about its routine business. Extracting what mattered from that footage required time and trained attention. Investigators reviewed it frame by frame. They mapped the movement of every person visible within it, cross-referencing positions and timing, and the specific sequence of events that preceded Aniah's exit from the store. They were looking for the man who had been near her. They were looking for the clearest possible visual record of his face, his build, his clothing, the particular details that would allow them to move from a figure captured on video to a specific individual who could be identified, located, and held accountable. Simultaneously, witness statements were being formally collected. The people who had been present at the gas station that night, those who had seen something or believed they had, or were uncertain whether what they had registered in the peripheral awareness of a late-night errand run had been significant, were now being asked to give formal accounts. This is painstaking work. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction shaped by attention and emotion and the gap between the moment of observation and the moment of recollection. Investigators working witness testimony understand this. They ask questions carefully. They cross-reference accounts against the physical and video evidence available, and they build toward a picture that is more reliable than any single account could be on its own. What those statements confirmed, in alignment with what the surveillance footage showed, was the presence of an unidentified man, his interaction with Aniah, the sequence of events that followed her exit from the store, the moment at which the ordinary atmosphere of a late-night convenience store stop transformed into something that no one present had been positioned to prevent. He was still unidentified. He was still free. He was somewhere in the world beyond the frame of the gas station cameras, carrying the consequences of what he had done while investigators worked through the footage and the statements and the forensic evidence with everything they had. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where the story demands it. The investigation knew what had happened. The vehicle in Montgomery had confirmed the nature of the crime. The The forensic evidence had established the severity of it. The surveillance footage and the witness accounts were closing in on the person responsible, but knowing what happened and knowing who did it are two different categories of knowledge, separated by a distance that only evidence can close. And in the hours and days that followed the vehicle's discovery, that distance was still very real. Have you ever received a piece of news that rearranged everything you understood about a situation in a single moment? That made something you had been hoping was not true suddenly impossible to deny. That is the position law enforcement and Aniah's family now occupy simultaneously, from different angles and with different information, but with the same fundamental weight pressing down on both. What had been confirmed? He was still somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation, moving freely through a world that had not yet caught up with what he had done. The surveillance footage held the answer. The witness statements were filling in the frame around it. The forensic evidence from the vehicle was building the foundation of probable cause. Every thread was being pulled at the same time, by people who understood that every hour the unidentified man remained unidentified was an hour in which the distance between him and accountability could grow. The question was not whether they would find him. The investigation's trajectory, even in these early days, pointed toward an answer. The question was what that answer would cost, measured in time, and in the additional layers of truth it would force into the open, not just about the man who had taken Aniah, but about the systems that had permitted him to be where he was when he made the choice to take her. That part of the story is coming, but it belongs to the next phase. Before we move there, take a moment to do something that matters. If this story has held your attention tonight, if Aniah Blanchard's name has settled into you the way real names do, the way the names of real people always do when their stories are told with the honesty they deserve, drop her name in the comments, not as a hashtag, not as a gesture, simply as an acknowledgement that she was here, that she mattered, and that the people who gather in this space refuse to let her be forgotten. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And if you are new here tonight, subscribe, because every story told on this channel is told with exactly this level of care, and there are more waiting for you. Aniah deserved better than what October 23rd, 2019 gave her. The least we can do is make sure the world keeps knowing her name. Here is something that does not get said often enough about the days after a person goes missing. The people who love them do not grieve, not yet. Grief belongs to confirmed loss, and confirmed loss had not yet arrived in the lives of the people who loved Aniah Blanchard. What arrived instead was motion. Pure, relentless, forward-driving motion, the refusal to be still, the instinctive understanding that stillness in the face of an unresolved disappearance is a form of surrender that no one who loved her was willing to accept. Grief would come later. It would come with its full weight and its full restructuring force, and when it came, nothing would be the same on the other side of it. But in these days, the days immediately following October 2003, 2019, what the people closest to Aniah felt was not grief. It was urgency. It was the specific, consuming energy of people who have decided, without discussion or deliberation, that they will not stop moving until they find an answer. Have you ever watched a community come together around something painful? Have you seen what people are capable of when they decide, collectively, that they will not let someone disappear without a fight? That is what Auburn became in the days after Aniah's disappearance. Not a city defined by its loss, but a city defined by its response to it, by the number of people who showed up, who printed flyers and drove streets and shared posts, and made calls and did everything within their reach to contribute to a search that none of them wanted to be necessary. The core tension of what this section carries is this: while the community mobilized visibly and loudly above ground, investigators were working with quiet precision below it, following the surveillance footage, the witness accounts, and the forensic evidence toward a name that the public did not yet have. Two parallel tracks, moving simultaneously toward a convergence that would break the suspension of uncertainty and replace it with something far harder to carry. What would investigators find when the footage was fully analyzed? What name would emerge from the surveillance records? And what would that name reveal about a system that had already had the chance to stop this? Those answers were coming. But first, a community had to search. Walt Harris made the first public appeal with the specific quality of desperation that cannot be performed. It can only be inhabited by people for whom the stakes are real enough to override every instinct toward privacy and composure. He was a professional athlete. He had spent years operating in public spaces, managing the gap between the person he was privately and the image he projected professionally. That skill, the cultivated ability to present oneself under pressure in ways that serve a purpose, is something fighters develop out of necessity. But this was not a press conference. This was a father standing in front of cameras because his daughter was missing, and the cameras represented the widest available reach, and reach was what the search required. He asked for information. He described Aniah in the specific, particular language of someone who actually knew her. Not the generalized language of a missing person report, but the lived, granular detail of a parent describing a child. The response was immediate and substantial. His public profile, which had spent years accumulating in the context of professional sports, was redirected entirely in those days toward a single purpose: finding Aniah. Angela Harris carried the search with the specific strength that mothers in crisis carry, not loud, not performative, but absolute. The kind of determination that does not require an audience and does not pause to assess how it is being perceived. She needed her daughter found. Everything else was secondary to that, and the people around her understood it and organized themselves around it accordingly. Volunteers arrived in numbers. People who had never met Aniah Blanchard, who knew her only from the flyers being distributed across Auburn and the posts spreading across social media feeds, showed up, because that is what communities do when they recognize that a loss this close to home requires a response this personal. Flyers were printed and carried to gas stations, community boards, store windows, and intersections. Aniah's face moved through Auburn and then beyond it, into Montgomery, into Birmingham, across the state, and eventually beyond Alabama entirely, carried by the specific, relentless momentum of social media when a story captures the attention of enough people simultaneously. Search teams organized and moved through the areas around Auburn in the rain, through wet fields and along rain-slicked roads and beneath skies that offered no comfort and no break in the weather that had been falling since the night she disappeared. People drove routes they thought she might have traveled. They stopped at locations that might have been relevant. They asked questions of anyone who might have seen something, heard something, registered anything that could be added to the map of information investigators were building. The image of those search parties, moving through the October rain, driven by love and the refusal to accept an unanswered question, is one that does not leave the people who were part of it. There is something about searching for someone you love in the rain that occupies a specific place in the emotional memory. The physical discomfort becomes irrelevant. The wet clothes, the cold air, the reduced visibility, none of it registers as hardship in the context of why you are out there. You are out there because the alternative is being inside. Waiting, and waiting, is the one thing that feels most unbearable. A community bore witness to its own grief through motion, and the rain fell on all of them, equally and without distinction, the way it falls on everything in this story, patient, persistent, and present for every moment of it. While volunteers moved through rain-soaked fields and shared Aniah's face across every platform available to them, a different kind of work was happening in a different kind of space, quieter, more contained, and moving with a precision that the public search, for all its breadth and heart, could not replicate. Investigators had what the gas station cameras had recorded. They had what witnesses had seen and formally reported. They had the forensic testimony of a black Honda CR-V found in Montgomery with its interior bearing the full weight of what had happened inside it. What they were doing now was threading these separate pieces of evidence into a single, coherent account, working backward from the disappearance toward the person responsible for it, following the trail that the evidence laid out one careful step at a time. This kind of investigative work does not move in straight lines. It moves the way all genuinely complex problems move, through dead ends and partial confirmations, through moments where a thread that seemed promising narrows into nothing, and a detail that seemed peripheral suddenly opens into something significant. It requires a tolerance for uncertainty that is different from the uncertainty the public search was navigating. The volunteers and family members searching Auburn's surrounding areas were living inside the uncertainty of not knowing where Aniah was. The investigators were living inside a different uncertainty. The uncertainty of not yet being able to attach a name and a location to a face that the cameras had captured and that the evidence was now demanding they identify. They got there. The convergence of the surveillance footage, the cross-referenced witness accounts, and the digital records pulled in the course of the investigation produced a name. Not a partial match. Not a person of interest whose connection to the evidence required further development before it could be stated with confidence. A name supported by the footage, corroborated by testimony, and anchored by physical evidence that placed him at the scene with Aniah on the night of October 23, 2019. That name was Ibrahim Yazid. The weight of that moment, the moment an investigation moves from pursuing an unidentified figure to pursuing a known individual, is difficult to overstate. Everything shifts when a name enters the picture. The abstract becomes specific. The search for a person of unknown identity becomes the pursuit of a particular human being whose life exists in records, whose movements can be traced, whose known associates and documented history suddenly become investigative resources. A name does not end an investigation, but it fundamentally changes what the investigation is. Yazid's presence on the surveillance footage was documented. His movements inside the convenience store that night were identifiable and consistent with what witnesses had described. The testimony gathered from people who had been present at the gas station corroborated what the cameras had captured. The interaction, the sequence of events, the moment Aniah exited the store and everything that followed. Each piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, and that direction had a name on it. An arrest warrant was issued. That warrant transformed the investigation's public dimension as well. The community that had been searching for Aniah now had something additional to hold. A name attached to the crime, a face attached to the name, and the knowledge that law enforcement was actively pursuing a specific individual. The abstract threat that had shadowed Auburn since October 23 now had a shape. Ibrahim Yazid was being sought. His identification had been made. His capture was now the investigation's immediate operational objective. But capturing him would require finding him first, and finding him would take longer than anyone wanted, for reasons that had less to do with the quality of the investigation and more to do with choices Yazid made after the warrant was issued, choices that would extend the search and force law enforcement into a pursuit that crossed state lines before it reached its conclusion. That part of the story comes next. What comes immediately before it is something that arrived alongside the identification of Yazid's name, something that investigators discovered when they pulled his records, when the full picture of who this man was and what his documented history looked like came into view. Something that did not change the direction of the investigation, because the direction was already clear, but something that changed the emotional register of everything around it completely. The warrant had been issued. The name was known. The investigation was now a pursuit. And then investigators looked at Ibrahim Yazid's criminal history, and what they found there shifted the entire story from a narrative about individual violence into something that demanded a harder set of questions. Questions about systems, about decisions, about the particular chain of institutional choices that had placed him in that gas station, free to make the choice he made on the night of October 2003, 2019. Those questions would not stay inside the investigation. They would move outward, the way significant truths always move, into the public conversation, into the community's grief, into the anger that had been building beneath the sorrow since the beginning. They would eventually move all the way to the Alabama State Legislature, where they would produce a change in the law that carries Aniah Blanchard's name to this day. But that movement begins here, with a name, with a warrant, and with a discovery about that name's documented history that changed everything about how this story would be understood by everyone who heard it. The rain kept falling, the community kept searching, and the investigation, now armed with the identification it had been working toward, turned its full attention toward the next necessary step. The man had a name. Now he needed to be found. When investigators pulled Ibrahim Yazid's criminal record, what they found did not require interpretation. It did not require analysis or context or the careful weighing of ambiguous information against competing possibilities. It stated itself plainly in the specific, unadorned language of legal documentation, and what it stated was this: Ibrahim Yazid was not an unknown quantity to the criminal justice system at the time he walked into that Auburn convenience store on the night of October 23, 2019. He was a known one, a documented one, a man whose history of violent behavior had already been formally recorded, formally charged, and formally processed by the very institutions whose function is to assess exactly that kind of risk. At the time of Aniah Blanchard's disappearance, Ibrahim Yazid was out on bond. The charges for which he had been released on bond included kidnapping and attempted murder. Allow those two sentences to occupy the space they deserve before this account moves any further. Not because dwelling on them produces anything useful, but because the full weight of what they represent cannot be absorbed in the half-second it takes to read them and move on. Kidnapping, attempted murder, these are not minor charges. These are not the kinds of offenses that sit at the edge of the legal system's concern, close enough to be processed but not serious enough to demand the most cautious possible response. These are violent felony charges, the most serious category of offense that the criminal justice system is designed to respond to with its most serious available tools. One of those tools is the denial of bail, the decision not to release a person facing charges of this nature back into the community while the legal process works toward resolution. The decision that the risk posed by that person's continued freedom outweighs whatever arguments exist in favor of releasing them. That decision had been available. It had not been made. Ibrahim Yazid had been released on bond. He had walked out of custody and back into the world with violent felony charges pending against him, charges that describe precisely the category of behavior he would go on to enact against Aniah Blanchard on a Wednesday night in Auburn. This is not speculation presented as fact. This is not a case where the connection between a prior charge and a subsequent crime requires a chain of reasoning so long that reasonable people could dispute it. The connection here is direct. The prior charges described violence of a specific and serious kind. The subsequent crime enacted violence of a specific and serious kind. The man who committed both had been in the custody of a system that had the authority to keep him there, and had chosen not to exercise that authority. When this information became public, when it moved from the records of the investigation into the awareness of the community that had been searching for Aniah and the wider public that had been following the case, the response was immediate, and it was not quiet. Grief does not stay in one emotional register when information like this enters it. It cannot. The sorrow that Auburn and Aniah's family had been carrying since October 23 was real, and it remained real. But sorrow is not the only thing a community feels when it learns that the violence done to one of its own was not simply a random convergence of a predator and a victim in an ordinary space. when it learns that the predator had already been identified as such, that the system had already encountered him, already charged him, and had still returned him to the streets where Aniah Blanchard was living her ordinary life, anger entered the story. Not the unfocused anger of people who need somewhere to direct an emotion too large to hold quietly, but the specific, pointed anger of people who have been presented with a sequence of institutional decisions and are capable of reading exactly what those decisions produced. Questions followed the anger as they always follow it when it has a specific target. How had this been permitted? At what point in the system's processing of Ibrahim Yazid had the assessment of his risk to the community been made? And on what basis had that assessment concluded that his release was appropriate? Who had made the bail decision? Under what framework? And with what information available to them? What would the outcome have been if the decision had gone differently? If the tools available to the system had been applied with the weight the charges warranted? These questions do not have answers that can be delivered in this account with the certainty that real answers require. The specifics of individual bail decisions exist within a legal and procedural context that resists the kind of clean retrospective clarity that hindsight seems to promise. What can be said, what the facts support without requiring anything beyond their plain statement, is that the system had encountered Ibrahim Yazid before October 23, 2019, and that the outcome of that encounter had placed him in a position to be present at that gas station, free and without constraint, on the night Aniah stopped there. Aniah's family absorbed this information with the particular devastation of people who are learning simultaneously both what happened to someone they love and that it did not have to happen. That distinction between a tragedy that could not have been prevented and one that a different set of decisions might have prevented is one of the most difficult things a grieving family can be asked to carry. It does not simplify the grief, it compounds it. It adds to the sorrow of the loss itself the additional unbearable weight of contingency, of what might have been. Walt Harris, Angela Harris, and the people closest to Aniah would carry that weight into every conversation they had about her case in the months and years that followed. It would shape the advocacy they pursued. It would give direction to the anger that sat alongside their grief. And it would eventually produce something that extended beyond the personal dimensions of their loss into the structural dimensions of the legal system that had failed their daughter. But that comes later. For now, the community was still waiting. The search was still ongoing, and Ibrahim Yazid, named and warranted, was not yet in custody. The rain fell on a town that was no longer only grieving. It was also angry, and anger, unlike grief, demands resolution. There is a specific kind of living that happens inside an unresolved tragedy. It is not the living that occurs before the tragedy, which moves at its own organic pace without awareness of what is coming. And it is not the living that occurs after confirmation, which reorganizes itself around a known loss and begins, however slowly and however painfully, the work of continuing. It is the living that happens in the middle, in the suspension between something terrible having occurred and the full facts of that terrible thing being available to the people who need them. Auburn was living in that middle space. The city had not stopped. Cities do not stop, even when the people inside them are carrying something that feels too heavy for ordinary motion to coexist with. The streets were still used. Businesses were still open. The rhythms of a college town continued their rotation because rhythms do not pause for grief. They simply absorb it, incorporating it into the texture of daily life the way a river incorporates rain, without visible disruption at the surface and with significant accumulation below. But something had changed in the quality of Auburn's ordinary functioning. The people moving through it were not moving through it the same way they had been moving through it before October 23. They were carrying something additional, an awareness, low-grade but persistent, that the city's sense of itself as a safe and knowable place had been challenged in a way that had not yet been resolved. Ibrahim Yazid had been identified. A warrant had been issued. and he was not yet in custody, which meant that the concrete resolution the community needed, the moment of capture that would close the gap between the crime and its consequences, had not yet arrived. Neighbors checked their news feeds with the specific frequency of people who are waiting for an update that has not come yet. Each refresh was a small act of hope. The hope that this would be the moment the story moved forward into something more final, something that reduced the uncertainty and replaced it with whatever came after it, even if what came after it was harder in some ways than the waiting. Certainty, even painful certainty, has a quality that uncertainty does not. It can be stood on. Uncertainty cannot. You cannot build anything on ground that has not yet declared what it is. The students at Southern Union State Community College were navigating something particularly difficult. They were grieving a classmate. That is the accurate description of their relationship to Aniah, not intimate friendship necessarily, but the specific proximity of people who share an academic space, who recognize each other in hallways and parking lots and the communal areas of campus life, who carry a background awareness of each other that only becomes conscious when one of them is suddenly absent. That kind of grief, classmate grief, neighbor grief, the grief of people who are adjacent to a life rather than central to it, does not have a clean social script. Because Aniah had not yet been officially declared dead, the grief could not yet fully land. There was no ceremony to attend, no formal acknowledgement that the worst had occurred, no socially recognized moment of confirmation that would grant permission for the mourning to become explicit and public. The students existed in a version of the same suspension Auburn itself was living in, knowing, in the way that people know things before those things are confirmed, that something irreversible had happened, but without the official structure of confirmed loss to give that knowledge a place to rest. That suspension is its own particular weight. It sits differently in the body than either hope or confirmed grief. It is not light enough to carry comfortably and not heavy enough yet to put down completely. It occupies a space that was not designed for long-term habitation, and the longer it persists, the more exhausting that occupation becomes. Walt Harris continued his public presence through it. Angela Harris continued hers. The family moved through the suspension with the specific endurance of people who have no alternative to endurance, who have chosen, consciously and continuously, to keep moving because stopping is not something they are willing to do while their daughter is still unaccounted for. The public appeals continued. The information sharing continued. The active, visible refusal to allow Aniah's name to slip out of public awareness continued with the consistency of people who understood that attention was a resource, and that resources in a missing person investigation are never wasted. The rain continued through all of it. This is not a narrative embellishment. October in Alabama carries rain with the patience that this particular October had carried it from the beginning, steady and low and present, in the way that things are present when they have decided to stay. It fell on Auburn's streets, and on the homes where families were waiting, and on the news feeds that neighbors were refreshing, and on the campus of Southern Union State Community College, where students were moving through a grief that had not yet been given its official name. It fell on the fields that search teams had covered and would cover again. It fell on the roads between Auburn and Montgomery and Macon County, between the places this story had already been and the places it was still moving toward. It fell with the specific patience of something that is not in a hurry because it understands that what it is accompanying is not something that resolves quickly. The waiting was not over. The anger that had entered alongside the grief was still present, still building toward the outlet it would eventually find. The name was known. The warrant was active. And somewhere beyond Auburn, moving through a geography that law enforcement was working to narrow, Ibrahim Yazid was still free. Not for much longer, but for now a town waited in the rain. And the rain, as it always had in this story, fell without urgency and without comfort and without any indication that it intended to stop. When an arrest warrant is issued, it represents the legal system's declaration that the evidence has crossed a threshold, that the weight of what has been gathered, the footage, the testimony, the forensic record, is sufficient to formally pursue a specific individual for a specific crime. It is a significant moment in any investigation. It is also, in cases where the named individual chooses to run, only the beginning of a different kind of pursuit. Ibrahim Yazid ran. The warrant had been issued. His name was known. His connection to the night of October 23, 2019 had been established through evidence that multiple investigative threads had independently confirmed. And rather than remain within reach of the legal process that was now formally seeking him, he made the decision to put distance between himself and its reach. That decision to flee rather than face told its own story about what he understood the evidence against him to mean. People who believe the case against them is weak do not run. They contest. They lawyer up and wait and trust the process to produce the outcome they expect. Running is the behavior of someone who has assessed the situation and concluded that staying is not an option they are willing to accept. Law enforcement responded to his flight with a coordination that cross-jurisdictional pursuits require. The case had already involved multiple agencies. The Auburn Police Department, the Lee County Sheriff's Office, and investigators operating at the state level had all been part of the investigation as it developed. Yazid's flight extended the operational geography of the pursuit beyond Alabama entirely. Credible intelligence placed him in Florida, which meant that the agencies working to locate him were now coordinating across state lines, sharing information and resources toward the common objective of closing the distance between the warrant and the man it named. A reward was offered for information leading directly to his capture. This was a strategic decision as much as a practical one. The public had been engaged with Aniah's case since the earliest days of the search. Her face had traveled across social media platforms and news cycles in ways that had built a wide and attentive audience for the investigation's developments. That audience was now a resource. People who might have seen something, who might have information about Yazid's movements or location or contacts, were being invited to bring that information forward with the incentive of a financial reward attached to its value. The public responded. The specific mechanics of how the tip or intelligence that led to his location was developed and acted upon belonged to the operational record of the investigation, rather than to this account. What this account can say is that the machinery of the pursuit, the coordination between agencies, the engagement of the public, the active and sustained pressure that a multi-jurisdictional manhunt applies to a person attempting to remain hidden, closed the distance that Yazid had tried to create between himself and accountability. He was found in Florida. He was apprehended after a brief pursuit involving law enforcement officers. The physical details of that apprehension, the specific circumstances of the encounter, the precise sequence of events that concluded with his arrest are less important to this story than what the arrest itself represented. He had run. He had been found. The gap between the warrant and its execution had been closed. His capture did not produce triumph. That is the word this account wants to be precise about, because triumph is what is sometimes assumed to accompany the arrest of a person responsible for a violent crime. Some emotional release, some sense of balance restored, some moment of catharsis that acknowledges the effort that went into the pursuit and rewards it with a feeling proportionate to the stakes. That is not what arrests produce in cases like this one. What they produce is a different kind of closure, partial, necessary, and accompanied by its own specific weight. The question of where Ibrahim Yazid was had now been answered. He was in custody. The legal process that his arrest initiated would take time to complete. Months would pass, then years between the moment of his capture and the moment a jury delivered its verdict. But the machinery of formal accountability had him within its reach, and it would not release him from that reach again. What his arrest did not answer was the question that Aniah's family had been carrying since the night she disappeared. The question that no arrest, however necessary, is capable of answering. Where was she? The vehicle in Montgomery had confirmed the nature of the crime. The forensic evidence had confirmed its severity. But Aniah herself remained unaccounted for, her location unknown, the full and final confirmation of her fate still withheld from the people who needed it most desperately and had been waiting for it longest. Walt Harris understood this. Angela Harris understood this. Yusuf al-Hasnawi understood this. Everyone who had been living inside this case from the beginning understood that Yazid's arrest, while critical and necessary, and the result of work that deserved acknowledgement, did not complete the answer. It completed one part of it. The other part was still out there, in a geography that the investigation had not yet fully mapped. It would be mapped. The search was still active, still moving, still carrying the weight of its unanswered question through the days that followed the arrest. Law enforcement continued working. The evidence continued accumulating. And somewhere in Alabama, in a location that would not remain unknown much longer, the final piece of this story was waiting to be found. The rain had not stopped, but it was running out of time. On November 25, 2019, human remains were discovered in a wooded area in Macon County, Alabama. This sentence does not require elaboration to carry its weight. It carries its weight entirely on its own, in the plain factual language of a discovery that ended one chapter of this story and began another. Macon County is approximately an hour's drive from Auburn, far enough from the gas station to represent deliberate distance, close enough to remain within the geography of a crime that had been contained, from the beginning, within the borders of a single state. The wooded area where the remains were found was not a place that would have been searched first, or early, or without the kind of investigative development that takes weeks to produce. It was found because the investigation had been relentless in its accumulation of information, and that accumulation had eventually pointed in a direction that led there. The process of identification that followed the discovery was handled with the procedural thoroughness that the circumstances required. Forensic identification is not instantaneous. It is methodical, careful work conducted by people whose professional obligation is to be certain before they are definitive, to confirm what the evidence shows rather than to assume what they hope or fear. That process was completed. The remains were positively identified as those of Aniah Blanchard. The confirmation was stated plainly when it came because plainness is the only register available for facts of this weight. There is no language calibrated to soften what that identification meant. The search was over, not resolved, over. The distinction matters. A resolved search ends with the person found safe, with the uncertainty replaced by relief, with the suspended grief dissolving back into the ordinary texture of a life that continues. This search ended differently. It ended with confirmation rather than resolution, with the suspended grief that had been accumulating across weeks of searching and waiting now given the specific, terrible permission to fully land. The phone call that delivered this confirmation to Aniah's family is not something this account will reconstruct. It does not need to be reconstructed. Every person listening to this story already knows what that call cost, knows it in the specific embodied way that human beings understand certain categories of pain without needing to have experienced them directly. Some things are communicated completely by their outline alone. That call is one of them. Walt Harris received it, Angela Harris received it, and everything that had been held in suspension since October 23, 2019 came down at once, with the full weight of weeks of accumulated dread behind it. The autopsy determined the cause of death, gunshot wounds. This finding is stated here exactly as it was stated in the official record, plainly, without elaboration, without the kind of clinical detail that serves no purpose in this account beyond adding specificity to suffering that is already sufficiently understood. She had been shot. That is what the evidence showed. That is what the record states. Under Alabama law, the combination of homicide and kidnapping, the two central criminal acts that the evidence had established, elevated the charge against Ibrahim Yazid to capital murder. The legal framework that had been building around the case since his identification and arrest now had its final structural piece. Capital murder carries with it the full weight of Alabama's most serious criminal designation, and the charge against Yazid was formally elevated to reflect the complete picture of what the evidence showed he had done. The rain, which had accompanied every step of this story from the first atmospheric breath of the opening to this moment, fell one last time on the account before stepping back. Not dramatically. Not with any ceremony that would draw attention to its own departure. It fell quietly, as it had always fallen, on Macon County and on Auburn, and on the distance between them, on the family that had just received the call, on the investigators who had found what they had been searching for, on a case that was now moving from the territory of the investigation into the territory of the law. Then it receded, as grief eventually recedes, not gone, but quieter, making room for what had to come next. What had to come next was a trial. Pause here, because this is where the story asks something of you directly. The discovery in Macon County did not end this story. It ended the search. It confirmed the loss. It provided the legal foundation for the most serious charge the state could bring. But the story itself, the full accounting of what happened to Aniah Blanchard and what her case demanded of the systems involved, was not finished. It was moving into the chapter that the legal system is specifically designed to address. And the legal system, in this case, would have to answer for more than just the crime. It would have to answer for itself. Have you ever watched a trial and wondered whether the outcome could ever feel like enough? Whether the word justice can really hold the weight that people need it to hold after a loss like this? It is one of the most honest questions that a case of this nature generates, and it deserves to be asked directly rather than sidestepped. Because the people sitting in that courtroom, Walt Harris, Angela Harris, and everyone who had loved Aniah and searched for her and waited through the suspension of weeks that had no certain ending, were not sitting there simply to watch a legal process complete itself. They were sitting there carrying a question that no verdict has ever been able to fully answer, and they knew it, and they came anyway. The trial was coming. The evidence was substantial. The prosecution had built a case across 4 interlocking categories of proof, and the weight of that case was significant. But the deeper question, the one that had been present since the moment the public learned that Ibrahim Yazid had been out on bond for violent felony charges when he took Aniah's life, was not solely about whether he would be convicted. It was about whether the system that had permitted his freedom would be held to any standard of accountability. Whether a conviction alone was sufficient response to a failure that had operated at the institutional level. The conviction would come, but would it be enough? And what structural change would have to occur? What would have to be built into the framework of the law itself, so that the next family did not have to sit in the same courthouse asking the same questions about the same category of broken decision that had made their loss possible? Those answers were weeks and months away from the moment of the discovery in Macon County, but they were coming, and the story was not finished until they arrived. The trial began in 2022. By the time it opened, the distance between the night of October 23, 2019 and the present had expanded to more than 2 years. 2 years in which Aniah's family had lived inside the specific, suspended existence of people waiting for a legal process to deliver the formal accountability that the evidence had long since established in their own understanding. Legal processes do not move at the pace of grief. They move at the pace of procedure. Deliberate, structured, governed by rules that exist for reasons that extend beyond any single case, and that do not bend to accommodate the urgency of the people most affected by the outcome. Walt Harris and Angela Harris understood this. It did not make the waiting easier, it simply made it necessary. The courtroom in which Ibrahim Yazid stood trial was the formal arena for everything the investigation had built across the months following October 23, 2019. The surveillance footage, the witness accounts, the forensic evidence recovered from the black Honda CR-V in Montgomery, the documented pattern of Yazid's movements in the days immediately following the crime. All of it had been organized, structured, and prepared for presentation to a jury whose function was to assess its collective weight and deliver a determination based on the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution built its case on 4 interlocking pillars, each of which was substantial on its own and considerably more powerful in combination with the others. The first was the surveillance footage from the gas station. The cameras inside that Auburn convenience store had captured Ibrahim Yazid on the night of October 23, 2019. They had documented his presence, his proximity to Aniah, and the sequence of events that preceded her exit from the store. That footage had been the thread that investigators had pulled first and most urgently in the days following her disappearance, and it remained, at trial, one of the clearest and most direct pieces of evidence connecting Yazid to the scene and to the victim. The second pillar was the witness testimony, the people who had been present at the gas station that night, who had seen what they had seen, registered what they had registered, and given formal accounts of it to investigators, testified to what the surveillance footage showed. Their accounts corroborated the video evidence and added the dimension of direct human observation to what the cameras had captured mechanically. Together, the footage and the testimony composed a picture of that night that did not depend on inference or interpretation. It was documented and witnessed. The third pillar was the forensic evidence recovered from the vehicle. The black Honda CR-V found in Montgomery had yielded physical evidence whose meaning was not ambiguous. The documentation of what had occurred inside that car, the blood, the evidence of struggle, the physical record of violence, had been analyzed and preserved and was now presented to the jury in the specific, credentialed language of forensic science. It established what had happened to Aniah inside her own vehicle and connected the physical reality of the crime to the legal charge that the state was pursuing. The fourth pillar was the pattern of Yazid's movements following the crime. The decisions he had made after October 23, the movement of the vehicle to Montgomery, the subsequent flight from Alabama when the warrant was issued, the cross-state pursuit that ended with his arrest in Florida, composed a behavioral record that spoke directly to consciousness of guilt. Innocent people do not take the specific sequence of steps that Ibrahim Yazid took in the days and weeks following Aniah Blanchard's disappearance. The pattern of his movements was not circumstantial in the loose sense that word is sometimes used. It was evidence of deliberate action taken by a person who understood what the evidence against him meant and responded to that understanding with flight. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case. That is the function of a defense: to contest, to question, to hold the prosecution to the burden of proof that the legal system requires it to meet, and to present whatever counterarguments the evidence and the law permit. The defense did its work. It did not overcome the cumulative weight of what the prosecution had assembled across 4 pillars of interlocking evidence, each of which supported and reinforced the others in ways that the defense's challenges could not individually or collectively dismantle. The jury deliberated and returned its verdict. Ibrahim Yazid was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The script marks this moment the way it deserves to be marked, not with celebration, not with the kind of emotional release that the word verdict sometimes promises and almost never fully delivers, but with gravity, quiet, appropriate, unembellished gravity. The legal system had been presented with the evidence of what Ibrahim Yazid had done, and it had responded with the most serious designation and the most permanent sentence available to it. That is what functioning looks like, within the constraints of what the legal system is actually capable of producing. It had functioned. What it could not do, what no verdict in the history of criminal justice has ever been able to do, was restore what had been taken. Aniah Blanchard was not returned to her family by the jury's decision. The specific future she had been building, the veterinary science degree, the relationship with Yusuf al-Hasnawi, the ordinary succession of Thursdays that had been waiting for her on the other side of that Wednesday night, was not restored by the sentence delivered. In that courtroom, the sentence was permanent. So was the loss. Both things were true simultaneously, and the people sitting in that courtroom understood both of them with a completeness that the verdict alone could not resolve. Justice had arrived, in the form available to it, in the form the system was designed to deliver. It was not enough. It was what there was. And for Walt Harris and Angela Harris, those two facts would live alongside each other for the rest of their lives, never resolving into one, never cancelling the other out. A verdict closes a trial. It does not close a story, and the people who understood this most clearly in the aftermath of Ibrahim Yazid's conviction were the same people who had been living inside this story since October 23, 2019. Walt Harris and Angela Harris, who had buried their daughter, endured the legal process, and emerged from the other side of it with a conviction in hand and a question still unanswered. The question was structural. It had been structural from the moment the public learned that Ibrahim Yazid had been free on bond for violent felony charges when he took Aniah's life. The verdict addressed the crime. It did not address the condition that had made the crime possible, and a family that had spent years inside the full weight of that distinction was not willing to let the condition go unaddressed, simply because the most immediately visible piece of the legal process had reached its conclusion. They pushed for a change in the law, and Alabama listened. Aniah's law is a constitutional amendment to the Alabama state constitution. It was passed through the ballot process, put before Alabama voters and approved, which means it did not enter the legal landscape through the ordinary legislative process alone, but through a direct expression of the public will. That distinction matters. A law passed by a legislature reflects the decisions of elected representatives. A constitutional amendment passed by voters reflects something broader, a collective determination made by the people of a state that the existing framework needed to be changed, and that the change needed to be durable enough to survive the ordinary fluctuations of legislative politics. What Aniah's law changed, specifically, is the framework within which Alabama judges make bail decisions. Prior to its passage, the list of offenses for which a judge could deny bail entirely could look at a defendant and the charges against them and conclude that no amount of money, no set of conditions, no monitoring arrangement was sufficient to justify returning that person to the community while their case moved through the courts. Was limited. Aniah's law expanded that list. It added offenses to the category for which detention without bail is a legally available option, giving judges the explicit authority to make the most protective decision available when the evidence and the charges warrant it. It does not mandate that judges deny bail in every case that falls within the expanded list. It does not remove judicial discretion. What it does is ensure that when a judge is sitting across from a defendant facing certain serious charges, the option of denying bail entirely is on the table, not as an extraordinary measure requiring extraordinary justification, but as a straightforwardly available tool that the law explicitly supports. The discretion remains. The option is now unambiguously present. For the people who had been asking, since the moment Yazid's prior charges became public, how a man facing kidnapping and attempted murder charges had been released on bond, Aniah's law represented the answer the legal system was capable of producing. not an explanation of the specific decision that had been made, not an accountability mechanism for the individuals involved in that decision, but a forward-facing structural change designed to reduce the probability that the same category of decision would produce the same category of outcome in cases that came after Aniah's. That is what legislative legacy looks like in practice. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with the emotional resolution of a verdict or the narrative clarity of a conviction. It arrives as language, specific, technical, constitutional language that restructures the options available to a judge in a courtroom that has not yet been built, in a case that has not yet been filed, involving a victim who has not yet been harmed. It is protection that travels forward into futures that cannot be seen from the present, offered by people who paid for it at a cost that cannot be calculated. Walt Harris and Angela Harris paid that cost. And they did not stop at the verdict. They took what they had lived through. Every day of the search, every hour of the waiting, every moment of the trial, every layer of the understanding that their daughter's death had been shaped by a system failure as much as by an individual act. And they translated it into advocacy, into testimony, into the specific, sustained public engagement that is required to move a constitutional amendment from a family's grief into a state's law. Aniah Blanchard's name is on that law, not as a tribute attached after the fact, but as the origin of the change itself. The law exists because she existed, because what happened to her exposed something that needed to be corrected, and because the people who loved her refused to allow that exposure to pass without consequence. Her name will be attached to that protection for as long as Alabama's Constitution holds it, which is to say, for as long as the state endures. There are people alive in Alabama today who will never be victims of violence they might otherwise have been because a judge, operating under the expanded framework that Aniah's law provides, will make a decision that the previous framework did not clearly support. Those people will never know Aniah's name. They will never know that the protection extended to them has her story at its origin. But the protection will be real, and it will reach them, and it will have come from her. That is what it means for a life to leave a mark that outlasts it. If this story has moved you tonight, if Aniah's name has settled into you the way it should, if the weight of what her family built from the wreckage of what they lost has registered with the significance it deserves, share this video. Not as an algorithmic gesture, but as an act of meaning. The more people who know about Aniah's law, the more people who understand what bail reform actually costs when it is absent, the more pressure exists on every legal system in every state to take seriously the decisions it makes about who it releases and who it protects. Sharing this story is how you participate in the work her family started. It costs you nothing. It honors everything. A conviction is not an ending. A law passed in a daughter's name is not an ending. For Walt Harris and Angela Harris, nothing about the formal resolution of the legal process that followed October 23, 2019, represented the conclusion of the work they had chosen to do with their grief. The verdict closed a chapter. It did not close their commitment to the broader landscape of issues that Aniah's case had made impossible for them to ignore. They remained present. In the public conversations about victim rights, the specific, often overlooked dimension of the criminal justice system that concerns itself with what is owed to the people most directly harmed by crime and to the families who carry the consequences of that harm long after the legal process has reached its formal end. In the ongoing discussions about public safety reform that extended beyond the specific question of bail and into the wider territory of how communities protect their most vulnerable members from violence that the system has already been given reason to anticipate. In the spaces where policy meets personal experience and where the testimony of people who have lived through systemic failure carries a weight that no abstract argument can replicate. This is what advocacy looks like when it emerges from genuine loss rather than from professional distance. It is not loud in the way the performances of advocacy are loud. It does not require an audience to sustain itself, because its source is not external validation, but internal obligation. The particular daily obligation of people who know something important and understand that knowing it privately is not sufficient. Walt Harris spoke because he had something to say that needed to be heard. Angela Harris engaged because the alternative to engagement was a silence she was not willing to accept. They were not transformed by their loss into something other than what they had been before it. They remained who they were, a family, a unit of people who loved each other and loved Aniah, carrying their grief alongside their lives rather than instead of them. That is the most accurate description of what long-term advocacy from loss looks like. Not heroism elevated to spectacle. Not the performance of resilience for an audience that needs to see it. Simply people who decided every day to do something with what they carried rather than be buried by it. That decision does not make the loss smaller. It does not resolve the grief or replace what was taken. It is not compensation. It is direction. And direction, when everything else has been stripped away, is one of the few things that allows a person to keep moving forward through a life that was permanently restructured by something they did not choose and could not prevent. Walt Harris and Angela Harris kept moving. They keep moving still. What does a story like this one ask of the people who receive it? Not fear. That is the first and most important clarification, because fear is the easiest response to reach for when a story moves through the territory this one has moved through. Fear of ordinary nights, fear of routine stops, fear of the specific familiar geography of a life that involves gas stations and late evenings, and the comfortable assumption that the next ordinary moment will be as unremarkable as the last one. That fear is understandable. It is also not what Aniah Blanchard's story is asking you to carry. What it asks for is awareness, the particular quality of attention that comes from understanding, genuinely, and not just abstractly, that the ordinary moments of a life are not guaranteed to continue, that they are in fact extraordinary in their ordinariness, in the specific, unrepeatable texture of their details, in the people present inside them, in the simple fact of their existence as moments being lived rather than remembered. Awareness does not produce paralysis. It produces presence. The decision to be more fully inside the moments that are available rather than moving through them at the distracted pace that ordinary life encourages. That is the invitation Aniah's story extends. To notice what you have while you have it, not with anxiety about its potential loss, but with the kind of deliberate appreciation that loss, when witnessed honestly, tends to generate in people willing to receive its instruction. Auburn continued. That is the final thing to be said about the city that held this story in its geography and its community memory and its ongoing daily life. It did not become defined by what happened inside it in October of 2019. The way places sometimes become defined by the worst things that occur within their borders. Reduced to a single event, flattened into a headline, robbed of the full complexity of everything else they contain. Auburn remained a college town. It remained a place where young people came to build something, where football Saturdays still arrived with their particular communal energy, where life continued at the pace that life continues when communities choose forward motion over permanent memorial. The people of Auburn grieved Aniah. They grieve her still, in the specific low-grade way that communities grieve people who were taken from them too early and too violently. And they continued living. Because that is what communities do, what people do, what the fundamental momentum of human life does when it is given the choice between continuation and collapse. It continues, not because the loss was small, but because continuation is itself a form of honoring. Because showing up for the ordinary moments of an ordinary life is, after you have witnessed what their absence costs, one of the most meaningful things a person can do. Aniah would have shown up. She was that kind of person. The rain is quieter now, not gone, not yet, but different. The steady, patient percussion that has accompanied every word of this story from its first breath to this one has softened into something closer to a whisper. The drops are further apart. The sound they make when they land is lighter, less insistent, as though the rain understands that the story it has been witnessing has reached the place where witnessing requires less presence and more space. It is stepping back the way all good companions step back when the person they have been walking beside needs room to be still. Let it step back now. Let the sound of it fade at the edges of your awareness the way it arrived. Gradually, without announcement, without demanding that you mark the moment of its departure. It has been here for the full length of this story. It has fallen on Auburn and on Montgomery and on Macon County and on every space this narrative has moved through. It has fallen on a family's grief and on a community's search and on a courtroom's verdict and on a law that carries a young woman's name into futures she will never see. It has done its work, and now it is releasing you, gently and without ceremony, into the stillness that comes after. This is that stillness now. The story of Aniah Blanchard has been told tonight in full, with the honesty it has always deserved, and with the care that every real name requires when it is carried through a space like this one. You have witnessed something true. You have held something heavy with the specific quality of attention that heavy things deserve. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the most quietly significant things one person can do for another across the distance of time and loss, to sit with their story, to receive it completely, and to carry their name forward into the world beyond this moment. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the remaining quiet of the rain settle around you like the specific, earned stillness of a night that has given everything it had to give. Let Aniah's name rest somewhere inside you, not as grief, not as fear, but as the particular kind of remembrance that belongs to people who deserved more time and whose absence continues to matter. Thank you for being here tonight. If this space is new to you, subscribe and stay. Every story told here is told with this same care, and there are many more waiting. And wherever tonight finds you, whatever the hour and whatever you are carrying into sleep, rest well. Aniah Blanchard deserved her Thursday morning. We still remember her. See you on the next one.